Picture yourself standing at the foot of a great medieval cathedral, gazing up at stone spires that seem to pierce the heavens. For centuries, we've been told these were monuments built by faithful, anonymous hands, silent testimonies to religious devotion alone. But what if that story missed something crucial? What if these magnificent structures held secrets, not in their relics or altars, but in the very stones themselves? Behind those soaring arches and intricate carvings lies a hidden history of power, resistance, and quiet revolution. This is the story of the Mason guilds, the forgotten architects of change in medieval Europe. They were far more than simple craftsmen. They were visionaries, organizers, and rebels who operated in plain sight, yet whose true influence has remained in the shadows for nearly 1,000 years. These guilds of stone builders did much more than construct buildings. They built a new world. In an age when society was rigidly divided between nobles, clergy, and peasants, these skilled artisans carved out a space for themselves that defied easy classification. Through secret symbols etched into stone, through collective bargaining that challenged feudal lords, and through networks that stretched across kingdoms, they quietly reshaped the economic and social landscape of Europe. They commanded respect not through birthright or divine authority, but through mastery of their craft and the sheer necessity of their skills. Imagine the audacity of it: humble stoneworkers negotiating with bishops, influencing urban design, and even encoding subversive messages in the very walls of churches. Their story is one of the most fascinating and overlooked chapters in medieval history, a narrative that redefines our understanding of how change actually happens in societies. What you're about to discover goes far beyond architecture. We'll unravel how these guilds functioned as early labor unions, how they created paths to social mobility unheard of in their time, and how their innovations laid the groundwork for everything from modern engineering to professional associations. We'll decode their hidden symbols, explore their clandestine meetings, and trace their economic impact that rippled across continents. This isn't just a story about the past. It's about how collective action, specialized knowledge, and quiet persistence can challenge even the most entrenched power structures. So join us on this journey into the hidden rebellion of the stone builders, and discover how these forgotten artisans didn't just build cathedrals, they helped build the modern world. Picture a solitary stonemason in the 10th century, his world limited to the sounds of his chisel and the rough texture of stone at a secluded monastery build site. He owned little more than his tools and the clothes on his back, moving from one remote project to the next, entirely dependent on the patronage of a local abbot or lord. For these early artisans, life was one of grueling itinerancy and profound obscurity. Their immense skill was often taken for granted, their compensation meager, and their status little higher than that of a common laborer. They were the anonymous hands behind the stone, essential yet invisible in the rigid feudal hierarchy that placed warriors and clerics at the top. This was the humble, disconnected existence from which something extraordinary would eventually grow. The catalyst for change was a dramatic shift in architectural ambition across Europe. As the first millennium turned, a wave of religious fervor and economic revival swept the continent. No longer satisfied with simple wooden churches, powerful bishops and wealthy monasteries began commissioning vast, fire-proof stone structures. Great abbeys, towering cathedrals, and fortified castles meant to last for centuries. This soaring demand for complex stonework created an urgent need for a reliable, highly skilled workforce. Suddenly, the lone mason with his specialized knowledge was no longer a wandering oddity. He was a precious commodity. This shift in their economic value was the first crack in the feudal wall, the initial leverage that would allow them to start reshaping their own destiny. Recognizing their newfound importance, these craftsmen began to organize. The first Mason guilds emerged not as formal institutions but as informal brotherhoods, mutual aid societies formed for the most practical of reasons. By banding together, they could protect the hard-won secrets of their trade, the precise geometry for a stable arch, the ideal mortar mix that could withstand centuries of frost, the method for carving a perfect spiral staircase within a confined tower. They could also ensure that their labor received fair compensation, collectively refusing to work for lords who offered pennies instead of pounds. A single mason was disposable. A whole guild of masons, essential to completing a bishop's glorious cathedral, was a force to be reckoned with. By the 12th century, these informal groups had crystallized into powerful and highly structured fraternities. They developed intricate systems of governance, with elected masters and wardens who enforced strict codes of conduct. Membership was tiered, beginning with the apprentice, a young boy who would spend 7 years learning the craft, not just how to swing a hammer but the sacred principles of geometry and design. After this period, he could become a journeyman, traveling from lodge to gain experience and prove his skill. Only after creating a masterwork, a piece that demonstrated unparalleled artistry and technical mastery, could he be recognized as a master mason himself, entitled to take on his own projects and train his own apprentices. This structure was more than a training program. It was a sophisticated knowledge economy. Guilds became living libraries, meticulously preserving and advancing architectural science. They maintained detailed records, often encoded in symbolic diagrams and secret manuscripts, covering everything from the engineering of foundations to the aesthetic principles of sculpting a gargoyle. This accumulated wisdom, passed down through generations, gave them a monopoly on technical expertise that neither kings nor clergy could replicate. Their legal standing grew alongside their knowledge, with many guilds securing royal charters that granted them extraordinary privileges, the right to hold their own courts, to set their own wages, and to be exempt from certain taxes and feudal duties. This transformation from scattered individuals to a powerful, self-governing collective was nothing short of revolutionary. In a society where power was supposed to flow from God to Pope to King to Lord, these guilds created a new axis of influence based on skill, knowledge, and collective action. They answered to their own laws and their own masters, creating a pocket of autonomy within the rigid feudal structure. This unique position, balanced between the earthly power of nobility and the spiritual authority of the church, set the stage for their quiet rebellion. They were not just building walls and vaults, they were laying the foundation for a new social order. Now, think about the view from a distance as you approached a major town in the year 1100. For centuries, the skyline would have been dominated by the squat, dark silhouette of a wooden fortress or a simple church tower. But then, something new began to pierce the horizon. First one, then another, and then dozens of needle-like stone spires reached for the clouds, catching the light in a way that wood and thatch never could. This was not a gradual change, it was a vertical revolution, and it was orchestrated entirely by the collective genius of the Mason guilds. They were the masterminds turning the dreams of bishops and the budgets of kings into breathtaking reality, literally raising the roof on what was architecturally possible. The secret to this skyward surge lay in a series of breathtaking innovations that solved problems which had baffled builders for generations. The most iconic of these was the flying buttress. Before this, the weight of a heavy stone roof and the outward thrust of its vaults had to be contained by immensely thick, solid walls, which meant buildings were dark, cramped, and couldn't be very tall. But some brilliant, unknown master mason had a revolutionary idea. Instead of building a solid wall to hold the roof up, why not build an elegant stone arm that reaches out from the outside to take the weight? The flying buttress acted like a stone brace, channeling the forces of gravity and thrust down and out into the ground, away from the main structure. This single invention liberated the walls from their load-bearing duty. Suddenly, those walls could be filled with vast, soaring windows, flooding the interior with divine light and creating the luminous, awe-inspiring spaces we now associate with Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame or Chartres. Working in tandem with the buttress was another guild innovation, the ribbed vault. Earlier vaulted ceilings were essentially massive, continuous shells of stone, complex to build and requiring support across their entire surface until the mortar set. The ribbed vault simplified and strengthened this process immensely. Guild masons designed a skeletal framework of arched stone ribs that would be erected first. These ribs defined the shape of the vault and carried the bulk of the load. The spaces between the ribs could then be filled with thinner, lighter stone panels. This was not only more efficient, it was structurally superior. The ribs distributed weight along specific, calculated lines directly down to the pillars and columns below, creating a clear and manageable flow of forces throughout the entire building. It was the medieval equivalent of a modern steel frame, allowing for taller naves and more complex, geometrically perfect ceiling patterns that turned the very roof overhead into a demonstration of celestial order and mathematical mastery. This was far more than an aesthetic contest between guilds. It was a practical response to a changing world. Medieval towns were expanding, and their congregations were growing. The old, dark, cramped churches could no longer hold the faithful. The new cathedral designs, enabled by these Mason Guild techniques, created cavernous interior spaces that could accommodate hundreds, even thousands of worshippers. They were designed to inspire, to overwhelm the senses, and to lift the spirit heavenward. The experience of walking into a cathedral like Amiens or Reims, with its impossible height and its walls of stained glass, was a form of theological argument made in stone and light. It was a physical manifestation of the glory of God, and it was the Mason guilds, with their slide rules and their compasses, their practical knowledge of physics and their artistic vision, who made it all possible. This expertise fundamentally altered the social dynamic between the craftsman and the patron. A bishop might have the divine authority and the fundraising power to commission a cathedral, but he had no idea how to build it. He was utterly dependent on the master mason and his guild. This necessity transformed their relationship from one of master and servant to a partnership, albeit a tense one. Guildmasters became consultants, advisors, and ultimately, the authorities on what was and wasn't structurally possible. They could push back on a patron's overly ambitious ideas or conversely, propose even more daring designs. Their names started to appear in ledgers and chronicles with greater frequency, and their compensation began to reflect their irreplaceable status. They were no longer just hired hands. They were the artists and engineers without whom the greatest ambitions of the age would have remained grounded, forever looking at the mud instead of the heavens. But how did these master builders ensure that their complex work, spread across thousands of stones and dozens of workers, met their exacting standards? The answer is chiseled into the very fabric of the buildings themselves. If you were to run your fingers along the stones of a medieval cathedral, away from the grand sculptures and in the quieter, structural parts of the building, you would feel them small, precise, and often enigmatic carvings. A simple geometric shape, a stylized tool, a tiny animal, or an intricate knotwork pattern. To the untrained eye, they might look like random doodles or the idle scratchings of a bored apprentice. But in reality, you are touching the signature of the artisan, a sophisticated system of quality control and communication that operated in plain sight. Each fully trained mason was required to create his own unique signature, known as a mason's mark. This was not a name written in letters, but a distinct and often geometric symbol that he would carve into every single stone he shaped and finished. Think of it as a barcode from the Middle Ages. When the stones arrived at the construction site and were assembled into a wall, the guild's wardens could easily identify which mason was responsible for each block. This system served a profoundly practical purpose. It ensured accountability. If a stone was poorly cut, didn't fit correctly, or showed signs of crumbling, the master builder could trace it back to the individual craftsman. That mason would then be responsible for fixing or replacing the faulty work, often at his own expense. This simple mark guaranteed a remarkably consistent level of quality across massive projects that could take decades to complete, creating an built-in incentive for excellence that benefited both the guild's reputation and the structural integrity of the cathedral. Yet, many historians argue that these marks held a deeper, more symbolic meaning that went far beyond mere accounting. In a society where the vast majority of the population was illiterate, visual symbols carried immense power and could convey complex ideas. A mark shaped like a compass might not just identify the carver, but also signify his belief in the divine order of geometry. A knot that had no beginning and no end could symbolize eternity or the interconnectedness of the guild brotherhood. Some masons chose marks that seemed to quietly challenge the established order. A carving of a dog, an animal often associated with loyalty and vigilance in medieval folklore, might be a subtle declaration of the mason's loyalty to his guild above his feudal lord. A rabbit, an animal known for burrowing and creating its own hidden networks, could be a clever nod to the secretive and subversive nature of the guilds themselves, operating beneath the surface of society. This visual language created a powerful sense of identity and solidarity. A journeyman mason traveling from a work site in France to another in England could walk into a lodge, show his unique mark registered in the guild's ledger, and immediately be recognized as a trained brother. He would be welcomed, given work, and offered support. His mark was his passport and his professional license. This network, connected by these silent symbols, allowed knowledge and techniques to flow freely across political and linguistic borders. A new method for calculating the pitch of a roof developed in Burgundy could find its way to a cathedral being built in Cologne because the masons shared a common bond and a common language etched in stone. They were building a professional identity that was completely separate from the feudal class they were born into, an identity based on skill and fraternity rather than land and title. Their legacy is therefore twofold: the breathtaking monuments we see today and the invisible web of meaning and mutual support they left behind, waiting for those who know how to look. Now, shift your perspective from the soaring heights of the cathedrals down to the dusty construction yard, where a very different kind of revolution was taking place. In the rigid feudal world, your place in life was determined at birth. If you were born a serf, you were expected to serve your lord without question, your labor owed as part of your very existence. The concept of negotiating for your work was not just unheard of, it was a direct challenge to the divine and social order. Yet, this is precisely what the Mason guilds began to do. Their irreplaceable skills gave them a form of power that was almost unique in medieval society: the power to say no. A lord could easily replace a farmhand, but he could not easily find another group of artisans capable of completing the intricate vaulting of his chapel. This fundamental imbalance of need versus skill became the foundation upon which they built the earliest models of collective bargaining. The mechanisms they developed were remarkably sophisticated. When a major project was commissioned, it wasn't a lone mason who would meet with the bishop or noble patron. It was a delegation from the guild led by an elected master. These men were not just artists, they were negotiators. They would arrive with detailed contracts, often specifying not just the total cost of the project, but the wages for different tiers of workers, the quality and source of stone to be used, and even clauses for safer working conditions, such as the construction of sturdy scaffolding and the provision of shelter. They understood the value of their time and their craft, and they insisted on being compensated as the highly trained specialists they were. For a master mason, this could mean a wage that surpassed that of a skilled knight, a staggering notion in a culture that prized martial prowess above all else. Perhaps their most powerful tool was the strategic work stoppage, a medieval strike. Imagine the scene, the construction of a cathedral, a project that might have already been underway for a decade, suddenly grinds to a complete halt. The cranes stand still, the chisels fall silent, and the all-important flow of stones from the quarry ceases. The patron, whether a bishop eager to see his legacy completed or a king anxious to fortify his castle, faces immense political and financial pressure. Every day of delay is a public embarrassment and a drain on resources. The guilds wielded this power with precision. Records from the construction of Canterbury Cathedral, for instance, show a work stoppage in 1170 that lasted for nearly a year until the dispute was settled on terms favorable to the masons. This was not a chaotic riot, it was a calculated withdrawal of labor, a clear demonstration that their cooperation was not a given but a negotiated condition. This collective action represented a seismic shift in the medieval mindset. It introduced the radical idea that labor had a value independent of the commands of authority, and that those who performed it had rights that could be asserted. The guilds created a system where advancement was based on merit and proven skill within the craft, not on birthright. A talented apprentice could rise to become a master and sit at the bargaining table with nobility, a social mobility that was virtually impossible anywhere else in feudal society. They weren't just building structures, they were building a new framework for economic relationships, one that placed knowledge and collective action at its center. This model of organized, skilled labor challenging entrenched power would echo through the centuries, laying the philosophical groundwork for the labor movements that would transform the modern world. To truly grasp the economic force of these guilds, we must look past the cathedral itself and see the vast economic ecosystem it supported. A single major construction project was less like building a structure and more like launching a major corporation in the heart of the medieval countryside. It all began with the earth itself. A quarry that might have been dormant for generations would suddenly spring to life, employing dozens of local laborers to extract the massive blocks of stone. These weren't just random dig sites. They were carefully selected by master masons for the quality and color of their stone, putting remote regions on the economic map for the first time. The demand was so immense it could operate a quarry for decades, creating a stable industry where none existed before. Then came the monumental task of moving this stone. A single block for a pillar could weigh several tons, and a cathedral required thousands of them. This necessitated a massive investment in infrastructure. Existing dirt tracks had to be widened and reinforced to bear the weight of heavy ox carts. In some cases, entirely new roads were built, paid for by the church or the crown, but demanded and often designed by the guilds to facilitate their work. This improved infrastructure didn't just benefit the construction, it boosted all trade in the region, making it easier for farmers to bring their goods to market and for merchants to travel. If water transport was an option, the guilds would commission the building of special barges, stimulating the local shipbuilding and dockworking trades. The very landscape was reshaped by the economic needs of the builders. Once the stone arrived at the building site, it triggered a whirlwind of secondary industries. The guilds may have been the masterminds, but they were not doing it alone. A bustling, temporary city would spring up around the worksite. Carpenters were hired in droves to build the incredibly complex scaffolding that climbed the rising walls and to construct the massive wooden cranes and treadwheels that hoisted the stones skyward. Blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge and sharpen the thousands of chisels, hammers, and drills that wore down with constant use, and to produce the heavy metal clamps and dowels that held the stonework together. Cartwrights were kept busy building and repairing wagons, while rope makers produced miles of sturdy hemp cordage for the cranes. Beyond the skilled trades, the project fed an entire community. Local farmers found a brand new, hungry market for their produce, selling grain, vegetables, and meat to feed the army of workers. Brewers and bakers expanded their operations to supply the daily needs of the site. Inns and boarding houses thrived, accommodating the journeyman masons who traveled from across Europe. Even the humble leatherworker had a role, crafting the aprons and protective gloves worn by the stonecutters. The wages paid to all these people, from the master mason down to the quarryman and the cart driver, circulated through the local economy, creating a period of remarkable prosperity that could transform a sleepy town into a thriving economic hub for a generation. The financial mechanisms behind these projects were as innovative as the engineering. The cost was astronomical, often exceeding the annual income of the entire kingdom. This forced the church and crown to develop entirely new ways of raising capital. Wealthy merchants and banking families, particularly from Italy, were approached for massive loans, effectively creating an early bond market where the future income from church lands or taxes was pledged as collateral. Donations were solicited from the public in exchange for indulgences or the promise of a burial place within the hallowed walls. This mobilization of capital on such a vast scale was a precursor to the modern financial system, moving wealth from stagnant coffers into dynamic, economy-driving projects. Ultimately, this control over such immense financial and physical resources led to a profound shift in the distribution of wealth. A successful master mason overseeing a major contract could accumulate a personal fortune that rivaled that of a minor nobleman. He could own property, educate his children, and live a life of comfort and respectability. The guilds themselves amassed significant collective wealth through membership dues and fees, which they used to support sick or retired members, their families, and to fund their own guild halls, impressive buildings that stood as symbols of their civic importance. This economic power gave them a voice. They became lenders to the crown, donors to the church, and influential members of the growing urban merchant class. They weren't just building with stone, they were building the very foundations of a monetized commercial economy, proving that wealth could be created through skill and enterprise, not just inherited through land and title. In the rigid world of medieval Europe, your destiny was typically carved in stone long before you drew your first breath. If you were born a peasant, you would likely die a peasant, bound to the land and the will of your lord, with as much chance of changing your station as the rocks in the field had of turning to gold. This was the unbreakable rule of feudal society, a world stratified by birthright, where bloodline meant everything and merit meant almost nothing. Yet, within this seemingly immutable structure, the Mason guilds carved out a remarkable exception, creating a narrow but powerful ladder that allowed a select few to climb toward a better life based on what they could do, not who they were born to be. This ladder began with the apprenticeship system, a rigorous and transformative 7-year journey. A young boy, perhaps the son of a farmer or a blacksmith, would be indentured to a master mason. His family might pay a small fee, or he might simply be pledged for the cost of his food and lodging. For those 7 years, he was more than a student. He was part of the master's household, learning the craft from the ground up. His training was astonishingly comprehensive. He started with the back-breaking labor of moving stone and mixing mortar, but he was also schooled in the sacred secrets of geometry and design. He learned to read intricate plans, to calculate complex stresses and loads, and to understand the precise mathematics that turned a pile of rocks into a structure that could defy gravity and time. This education was, in many ways, more advanced and practical than what was offered in the universities of the day, which focused on theology and classical philosophy. The guild apprentice was learning applied science and high art, a combination that made him incredibly valuable. Upon completing his apprenticeship, the young man would become a journeyman, a title derived from the French journée, meaning day, as he was now paid a daily wage for his labor. This was the most transformative phase of his career. He was expected to travel, to leave his home lodge and work on different sites across the country, or even across Europe. This travel was not a mere adventure, it was a crucial part of his professional development. It exposed him to different regional styles, innovative techniques, and new masters with unique expertise. He carried with him a traveling book of his designs and his unique mason's mark, his passport into a fraternity that recognized skill above all else. In every new town, he could present himself at the local guild lodge and be guaranteed work, shelter, and a community of brothers. This network was a social safety net unlike any other in the medieval world, providing mobility and opportunity that was simply unavailable to the vast majority of the population. The pinnacle of this journey was the achievement of master status. To earn this title, a journeyman had to create a masterpiece, not just a beautiful sculpture, but a complex piece of work that demonstrated his complete mastery of the craft's theoretical and practical aspects. This might be the detailed design for a vaulted ceiling, a scale model of a flying buttress system, or an intricate piece of stone tracery for a window. His work would be judged by a council of existing masters, a peer review system that ensured standards remained exceptionally high. If he passed, he was no longer just a laborer, he was a gentleman craftsman. He could now take on his own apprentices, bid for contracts, and lead major projects. His social status underwent a dramatic shift. He was addressed as master and consulted by bishops and nobles as an equal in matters of his expertise. The financial rewards that followed this achievement were profound. A master mason working on a cathedral could earn a wage that dwarfed that of a skilled knight. Records from the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral in London show master masons being paid several shillings a day, while a knight's daily wage might be measured in pennies. This income allowed them to accumulate wealth on a scale previously reserved for the landed gentry. They could purchase fine townhouses, acquire parcels of land, and provide their children with educations that would launch them into even more prestigious professions like law or the church. In many growing medieval towns, citizenship was granted based on property ownership and wealth, and successful masons routinely met these requirements, becoming voting, influential members of the urban elite. They were living proof that a man could craft his own destiny, that value could be created through knowledge and skill, and that the ancient walls of feudal class were not, in fact, impregnable. Their very existence whispered a revolutionary idea into the ear of medieval society, that a person's worth might be measured by their contribution, not their pedigree. When we picture the bustling construction site of a medieval cathedral, our minds naturally conjure images of burly quarrymen, focused stonecutters, and master masons with their measuring rods. This mental image isn't entirely wrong, but it's profoundly incomplete. Hidden within the financial records, legal disputes, and workshop accounts of the time lies a different story, one that reveals women were not merely peripheral figures but essential, if often unacknowledged, contributors to the Mason Guild's monumental achievements. Their roles were forged not through formal membership, which was largely denied to them, but through necessity, pragmatism, and quiet determination, bending the rigid gender norms of their time without ever quite breaking them. The most common and legally accepted route for a woman's involvement was through the workshop itself, not as an independent artisan but as a keeper of a legacy. When a master mason died, his widow faced a precarious future. The workshop was not just a business, it was the family's entire source of income, its physical assets, its tools, and its reputation. Medieval law and guild statutes, while restrictive, often contained a crucial loophole for this exact scenario. A widow could petition the guild for the right to maintain and manage her late husband's workshop. This was rarely framed as granting her the status of a master, a title reserved for men who had created a masterpiece, but rather as a temporary stewardship. She became the Baumeisterin, the mistress of the works, a title that conferred responsibility without official rank. In this capacity, these women did far more than simply keep the books until a male relative could take over. They were responsible for every aspect of a complex operation. They negotiated with patrons and bishops for new contracts, ensuring the terms were favorable and the payments were timely. They managed the payroll for the journeymen and apprentices, who continued to live and work in the workshop as part of the extended household. They sourced materials, overseeing the quality of stone delivered from the quarries and the delivery of timber for scaffolding. Most importantly, they ensured the continuity of training for the apprentices, who were legally bound to their late master's household. In essence, they became the chief executive of a sophisticated architectural firm, preserving their husband's professional legacy and providing stability for the entire team that depended on it. Their authority was practical and economic, derived from their indispensable role in keeping the enterprise afloat. Beyond the workshop, women contributed to the vast economic engine of construction in more direct, physical ways, though these contributions are even harder to trace in the historical record. In quarrying towns, particularly in parts of Germany and England, it was not uncommon for women to work alongside their husbands and fathers. They would break larger stones into more manageable pieces, sort rubble for use in mortar and infill, and even operate the winches and pulleys that moved stone. Their smaller hands were sometimes an advantage in the delicate work of carving decorative elements. While the grand sculptures of saints and kings were almost exclusively the domain of master carvers, the repetitive patterns of foliage, the intricate geometric borders on archways, and the simpler decorative knots were often the work of skilled but unnamed hands, and some of those hands were almost certainly female. Perhaps the most surprising role, and one that speaks to the hidden financial power some women wielded, was that of the financier or supplier, the wife of a wealthy merchant managing her own finances or even running a business in her own right, might invest in a quarry, seeing the cathedral project as a long-term, lucrative enterprise. Others became specialists in supplying specific materials. A woman might control the production of lime for mortar from a local kiln, or manage a forest whose timber was crucial for scaffolding and cranes. They provided the essential capital and resources that enabled the grand artistic visions of the Masons to become reality. Their influence felt in every sack of lime and every load of timber that arrived on site, even if their names were absent from the guild rolls. The story of these women is not one of open rebellion but of pragmatic infiltration. They operated within the constraints of a patriarchal system, using the avenues available to them, widowhood, family business, and economic niche, to claim space and exert influence. Their involvement challenged the period's gender norms simply by existing, demonstrating capability in realms of finance, management, and craft that were officially reserved for men. They added a critical layer of diversity and resilience to the guild operations, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and projects continued even after the death of a master. Their history, fragmentary and often overlooked, reminds us that the great edifices of the past were built not by a monolithic group of men, but by entire communities whose full story includes the quiet, persistent, and essential contributions of women working from the shadows. This dynamic interplay of rivalry and cooperation created an engine of progress that propelled medieval architecture to breathtaking heights. Picture the atmosphere in two rival cities, perhaps Chartres and Amiens, each determined to construct the cathedral with the most awe-inspiring spire. The master masons leading these projects weren't just artisans, they were de facto CEOs of highly competitive firms, and their reputation and future contracts rested on their ability to innovate. In the lodge of one guild, masters might huddle over parchment, sketching feverish designs for a new type of flying buttress that could allow for even thinner walls and larger windows. They would conduct their experiments in secluded areas of the worksite, using canvas screens to shield their latest crane modifications or their secret mortar mix from prying eyes. The formula for this mortar, a carefully guarded combination of lime, sand, and sometimes mysterious additives like egg whites or even animal blood, was a crown jewel. Letting a competitor acquire it could mean losing a crucial advantage. This fierce protection of intellectual property didn't stop at physical barriers, it extended into the very culture of the guilds. Their most advanced techniques were often encoded in complex geometric diagrams and symbolic drawings, a language understandable only to initiated masters. An apprentice might learn how to execute a task, but the underlying mathematical principle, the why it worked, was reserved for those who had proven their loyalty and skill. This secrecy wasn't born of mere paranoia, it was a practical business strategy. A guild known for a particular innovation, say a method for constructing a self-supporting stone staircase, could command higher fees and be sought after for specific projects across Europe. Their unique knowledge was their brand, and they defended it with the intensity of a modern tech company guarding its proprietary code. Yet, for all this intense competition, a paradoxical spirit of collaboration was equally vital to their success. The scale of a major cathedral was simply too immense for any single guild to handle entirely on its own, especially when specialized skills were required. A guild renowned for its intricate stone carving might be brought in to work alongside a guild celebrated for its structural engineering. This necessity forced a temporary truce in the ongoing rivalry, a professional respect that transcended regional pride. Furthermore, the tradition of the journeyman's travel ensured a constant, though controlled, cross-pollination of ideas. A journeyman from Cologne, having learned a novel method for tracing the pattern of a rose window, would carry that knowledge to his next worksite in Paris. He wouldn't reveal the deepest secrets of his home lodge, but he would bring with him a broader perspective and new solutions to common problems, effectively acting as a benign agent of espionage who benefited everyone. This blend of cutthroat competition and essential cooperation accelerated innovation at a remarkable pace. The race to build taller spurred developments in structural engineering and the science of materials. The desire to create more luminous interiors led to experiments with different types of glass and leading for stained windows. Practical challenges on the ground demanded better tools, giving rise to improvements in pulley systems, winches, and the great treadwheel cranes that were the heavy machinery of their day. Each guild, in its drive to outdo the others, was inadvertently pushing the entire field forward. They were engaged in a centuries-long, continent-wide dialogue conducted not with words, but with stone and glass, each new cathedral a statement in an ongoing argument about beauty, strength, and ambition. The stunning architectural diversity we see across Europe, from the flamboyant flair of French Gothic to the more restrained verticality of the English perpendicular style, is a direct testament to these localized rivalries, each guild imprinting its regional identity and hard-won innovations on the skyline. Now consider the delicate and often tense negotiation happening in the bishop's chambers, far from the noisy construction site. On one side stands the bishop, a prince of the church, representing divine authority and the unwavering doctrines of faith. His vision for the cathedral is clear, a monument to God's glory that reinforces church teachings and inspires pious obedience. On the other side stands the master mason, a prince of his craft, representing the unyielding laws of physics and the artistic spirit. His vision is for a structure that defies gravity, bathes the interior in celestial light, and stands as a testament to human ingenuity. This was not a simple transaction between a client and a contractor. It was a complex dance of power, faith, and necessity, where each partner held a form of leverage the other desperately needed. The church's power was undeniable. It controlled the vast wealth, the land, and the spiritual mandate required to launch these decades-long projects. A bishop's patronage provided the Mason guilds with something beyond money. It offered legitimacy and social standing in a deeply religious society. To be the chosen builder of a great cathedral was the highest honor, a contract that could define a guild's reputation for a century. This patronage came with an implicit expectation of control. Church authorities had committees of clerics, often with very specific ideas about theological symbolism, the arrangement of altars, the hierarchy of saints depicted in sculpture, and the overall message the building should convey. They saw the cathedral as a tool for instruction and worship, its design a matter of doctrinal importance. Yet, the master mason possessed a different kind of power, the power of how. The bishop could dictate the what, but he was almost entirely reliant on the mason's expertise for its execution. When a cleric insisted on a window of a certain impossible size or a spire of a breathtaking height, the master mason could respond not with defiance, but with a quiet, technical explanation of structural limitations. He was the gatekeeper of the possible. This expertise granted him a significant degree of artistic autonomy. While the overall program was religious, the execution was filled with the mason's secular spirit. Look closely at the stonework in any great cathedral, and you'll find a world that exists alongside the sacred. Among the solemn apostles and stern prophets, mischievous gargoyles leer from the rainspouts. In the margins of capitals and the shadows of choir stalls, stone carvers depicted scenes from everyday life: a farmer tending his sheep, a baker pulling bread from an oven, even humorous and sometimes bawdy caricatures of local figures. These were not sanctioned by the clergy. They were the subtle imprint of the artisan's world, a silent assertion of their creative presence within God's house. This autonomy sometimes extended into more daring territory. The very geometry that allowed these buildings to soar was to the Masons a language of divine order, but one they understood better than many of the clerics. The precise ratios, the sacred proportions, the complex patterns of the rose windows, these were expressions of a universal truth that the Masons believed they were uniquely qualified to interpret. At times, this led to designs that gently challenged strict orthodoxy. A window might subtly emphasize the humanity of a saint over their divinity, or a sculptural program might incorporate pre-Christian symbols of nature and the cosmos, weaving older, universal beliefs into the Christian narrative. The guilds, in essence, became silent theological partners, using stone and light to contribute to the religious conversation of their age. Their leverage also had a more practical, social dimension. The guilds were often composed of deeply religious men, but they were also laymen, not clergy. They understood the value of the growing merchant and artisan classes who funded these projects through donations. There are recorded instances of guilds negotiating for the inclusion of these lay benefactors in the cathedral's art. A wealthy merchant who funded a chapel might be immortalized in a stained glass window, kneeling in prayer, a remarkable honor for someone outside the ecclesiastical hierarchy. A guild itself might commission a window depicting their patron saint, with the masons at their work shown below. These inclusions were a quiet revolution, subtly shifting the narrative of the church from a space dominated solely by saints and clergy to one that acknowledged the role and piety of the common people who built and funded it. The relationship between church and guild was thus a perpetual push and pull, a partnership where spiritual authority and technical mastery met, debated, and ultimately collaborated to create some of the most profound spaces in human history. Consider the journey of a master mason from the workshops of Paris, his most precious possessions not jewels or coin, but a roll of carefully drawn parchment plans and a set of finely made metal compasses and rules. He would travel for weeks, perhaps crossing the war-torn landscape of Normandy before braving the unpredictable waters of the English Channel, all to answer the call of a distant bishop or king. His passage was safeguarded by letters of introduction from his home guild and the universal respect for his skills, allowing him to move through territories where ordinary travelers might be turned back or robbed. This was not an uncommon occurrence. The master mason was a node in a vast, invisible web that stretched across the fractured map of medieval Europe, a living conduit for the flow of architectural knowledge that ignored the petty squabbles of kings and the borders of nascent nation-states. This mobility was the lifeblood of architectural innovation. When a master arrived at a new site, say the nascent Canterbury Cathedral in England after the fire of 1174, he did not arrive empty-handed. He brought with him the collective intelligence of the French Gothic Revolution, the precise mathematical ratios for a stable pointed arch, the templates for a new style of clustered column, and the revolutionary concept of the flying buttress. Under the direction of such masters like the famed William of Sense who worked at Canterbury, these imported ideas were not merely copied but adapted. English stone had different properties than French limestone. Local climates demanded adjustments to roof pitches and drainage, and regional aesthetic tastes influenced the decorative details. The result was not a French cathedral on English soil, but a new hybrid style, in this case the earliest beginnings of what would become English Gothic architecture. This process repeated itself from Spain to Sweden, with each region interpreting the core principles brought by traveling masons through the lens of their own materials, traditions, and light, creating the rich tapestry of regional variations that still delights us today. To support this constant movement of people and ideas, the guilds established a critical infrastructure, the network of lodges. A lodge was far more than a simple workshop or a site hut. It was a combination of a headquarters, a boarding house, a library, and a social club. In major cities like Cologne, Strasbourg, or Vienna, these lodges became permanent institutions, often substantial buildings in their own right located near the cathedral square. For a journeyman mason traveling hundreds of miles from home, the local lodge was his sanctuary. Here he could present his credentials, his unique mason's mark recorded in his traveling book, and be guaranteed a bed, a hot meal, and news of work opportunities. More importantly, the lodge was a clearinghouse for knowledge. Masters would discuss structural challenges over meals. Journeymen would share sketches of novel techniques they had seen in other cities, and the lodge's own collection of templates and pattern books would be available for study. This system ensured that a breakthrough in solving a tricky vaulting problem in Prague could be discussed and adapted in Milan within a year, creating a feedback loop of innovation that accelerated the pace of architectural evolution across the continent. This pan-European professional community represented a profound challenge to the prevailing world order. In an age where identity was fiercely local, defined by your village, your feudal lord, or your regional dialect, the Mason guilds fostered a transnational identity based on skill and fraternity. A master from Germany and a master from Italy, who might not even share a common spoken language, could communicate perfectly through the universal language of geometry and architectural drawing. Their shared understanding of load, thrust, and proportion created a bond that was often stronger than political or linguistic allegiance. They operated under a common set of professional standards and ethical codes that were enforced by the guild network itself, not by any king or emperor. In this way, they built something even more durable than their stone cathedrals. They built one of the first truly international communities, a republic of skilled craftsmen whose citizenship was earned by merit and whose borders were drawn only by the limits of their ambition and knowledge. Yet even as this wave of death receded, it left behind a transformed landscape of both despair and unprecedented opportunity. The sheer scale of the mortality created a catastrophic labor shortage that shattered the old economic certainties. Fields lay fallow for want of hands to plow them, workshops stood silent, and entire villages were emptied. In this new world, the basic feudal principle that labor was abundant and therefore cheap was turned completely on its head. For the first time in centuries, skilled labor became an incredibly scarce and valuable commodity, and among all the skilled workers of medieval Europe, none were positioned to benefit more dramatically than the Mason guilds. Their expertise was not just a trade, it was the essential ingredient for the two things a traumatized society craved most: spiritual solace and physical rebuilding. The immediate economic effect was a seismic shift in bargaining power. Before the plague, a lord or bishop could dictate terms, knowing that if one mason refused a contract, another would quickly take his place. After the plague, that dynamic evaporated. A master mason who had survived, along with a core of his journeymen, now found himself in an extraordinarily strong position. He was one of the few people left who could actually execute the complex, ambitious projects that communities were desperate to undertake. This scarcity allowed guilds to demand and receive wages that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Records from England show that the daily wage for a master mason increased by 50% or more in the decades following the Black Death. They could also insist on better working conditions, longer contracts, and bonuses for completing specific stages of a project. For the first time, the balance of power had decisively tipped from the patron to the artisan. Recognizing this newfound advantage, the guilds moved quickly to consolidate their gains and protect their privileged status. They tightened control over membership, making it more difficult and expensive to become a master. The number of apprentices a master could train was often restricted, and the journey to mastery became longer and more arduous. This was not mere cruelty. It was a calculated strategy to limit the supply of new masons and thereby keep wages high. The guilds transformed from open fraternities focused on training into more exclusive corporations focused on protecting the economic interests of their existing members. They became powerful lobbying groups, petitioning kings and parliaments to pass laws that enforced their wage demands and restricted the ability of unaffiliated workers to undercut them. In essence, they used the crisis to institutionalize their value, transforming their temporary advantage into lasting economic clout. Paradoxically, this period of immense death also triggered an astonishing surge in new construction, particularly of cathedrals and large churches. The psychological impulse behind this building boom was profound. Survivors, grappling with unimaginable loss and terror, sought to appease a wrathful god and ensure divine protection against future outbreaks. What better way to demonstrate piety and secure salvation than by commissioning a magnificent new house for God? Communities pooled their resources, often funded by the bequests of those who had died, to embark on these enormous projects. They were acts of collective penance and desperate hope, and they required the only people who could deliver them, the Mason guilds. Far from bringing construction to a halt, the Black Death created a surge of new commissions, making the surviving masons busier and more essential than ever before. This confluence of events, catastrophic population decline, skyrocketing wages, exclusive guild policies, and a spiritual building frenzy, catapulted the Mason guilds into a role they had never before occupied. They were no longer just skilled contractors. They became indispensable agents of renewal, the key figures in a society's attempt to rebuild itself both physically and spiritually. Their master masons were consulted not just on engineering matters, but on town planning, fortification, and even financial logistics. Their wealth and influence now rivaled that of the merchant classes, and their opinions carried weight in civic affairs. The plague had, in a horrifying and unintended way, completed their centuries-long journey from obscure itinerant workers to central pillars of the medieval world, their status solidified in the very stone and mortar they used to help a broken world heal. In the heart of a feudal world where a local lord's word was the ultimate law, a remarkable exception was taking root within the Mason guilds. Picture a dispute between two journeymen over a boundary dispute on the worksite, or a complaint from a patron about the quality of stonework. In any other context, these matters would be dragged before the manor court, judged by a nobleman who knew little of construction and whose ruling would be based on local custom, not craft expertise. But for the Masons, justice was administered much closer to home. The master and wardens of the guild would convene a hearing within the lodge, listening to testimony from fellow craftsmen who understood the nuances of the work. Their judgment was not based on feudal tradition but on the guild's own detailed ordinances and the shared standards of their craft. This was legal autonomy in action, a privilege that carved out islands of self-rule in a sea of feudal obligation. This extraordinary right to self-govern did not appear by accident. It was hard-won through formal recognition. Kings and high-ranking bishops, desperate to see their own monumental building projects completed efficiently and to the highest standard, granted guilds official charters. These documents were essentially contracts that placed the guild and its members under direct royal or ecclesiastical jurisdiction, effectively removing them from the legal control of the local baron or count. This was a pragmatic decision. A feudal lord might be tempted to impress local masons into building his own castle walls or to levy heavy taxes on their wages, disrupting the delicate and years-long timeline of a cathedral's construction. By placing the guild under the distant, protective umbrella of the crown or the papacy, these powerful patrons ensured a steady, uninterrupted, and expert workforce dedicated solely to their grand vision. The charter was the guild's shield, and they guarded it fiercely. The scope of this self-rule was astonishingly broad for its time. Within their jurisdiction, guilds acted as miniature governments. They established their own detailed statutes that covered every aspect of professional and personal conduct. These rules set standardized wages to prevent undercutting, defined the precise number of years for apprenticeships, and outlined the requirements for creating a masterwork. They regulated quality with meticulous precision, specifying the exact mix for mortar or the proper grain of stone to be used, but their authority extended beyond the worksite. Guild courts could settle disputes between members over debts or property, adjudicate allegations of theft or fraud, and even hear cases of assault that occurred within the guild's precincts. They had the power to levy fines, impose bans from working on certain projects, and in extreme cases, expel members from the guild entirely, a punishment that could effectively end a man's career and social standing. This system presented a quiet but profound challenge to the foundational principle of feudal society, that all authority, from the king down to the lowest bailiff, was intrinsically tied to the ownership of land. A lord's power came from his estate, a vassal's duty was to the land he held. The Mason guilds operated on a completely different model. Their authority was derived from skill, from contract, and from the collective recognition of their expertise. Their citizenship was based on mastery of a craft, not on birth within a territory. A man standing within the guild was determined by his ability and his adherence to the group's rules, not by his father's name or the acreage he owned. In their lodges, they were creating a prototype of a meritocracy, a system where what you knew was more important than who you were born to be. By functioning as these self-contained legal entities, the guilds were demonstrating that effective governance could be organized around principles other than hereditary landownership. They were a living, working example of an alternative social structure, one based on voluntary association, mutual responsibility, and professional standards. This did not go unnoticed by the growing merchant classes in the towns, who watched and learned from the Masons' example. The guild's ability to regulate its own affairs, to protect its members from arbitrary local justice, and to create a stable economic environment through collective agreement showed that there were other ways to structure power and community. They were, in their own way, laying the early legal and philosophical groundwork for the concepts of corporate law and professional self-regulation, proving that authority could be legitimately vested in an institution built on knowledge and consent, rather than solely on the feudal rights of a landed aristocracy. Think of a 12-year-old boy arriving for his first day at a mason's lodge, his world about to expand far beyond the fields or workshop he knew. He wasn't just signing up for a job, he was entering a 7-year immersive academy, a system of knowledge transfer so effective it would put many modern institutions to shame. This apprenticeship was the absolute bedrock of the guild's power, a meticulously designed pipeline that transformed raw, unproven youth into masters of geometry, physics, and art. It was a closed loop of excellence, ensuring that the hard-won secrets of building a structure that could stand for a millennium were not lost to time or carelessness. For the young apprentice, the lodge became his classroom, his home, and his entire world, a demanding crucible that forged not just craftsmen but innovators. His education was a dual curriculum, brilliantly blending relentless hands-on practice with profound theoretical understanding. The day began before sunrise with the most grueling physical labor, hauling stone, mixing vast troughs of mortar, and sharpening the endless array of tools. This wasn't mere drudgery, it was foundational. By feeling the weight and grain of different types of limestone and sandstone, he developed an intuitive sense of material science. By spending months perfecting the consistency of mortar, he learned the chemistry of binding agents through touch and sight. This physical immersion gave him a deep, non-verbal knowledge that pure theory could never provide. He was learning the language of his materials, a conversation conducted with his hands, his back, and his unwavering attention to detail. But his training soared far beyond the physical. In the evenings or during breaks sheltered from the rain, the master would bring out the sacred tools of the trade, the compass, the straightedge, and the square. On wax tablets or scraps of parchment, the apprentice would learn the divine language of geometry. He wasn't just memorizing shapes, he was internalizing the universal principles of proportion and stress that govern the universe. He learned how to use complex geometric constructions to calculate the precise angle of a vault rib, to lay out the perfect template for a window, or to ensure that the weight of a tower was distributed evenly down to its foundations. This knowledge was often encoded in intricate diagrams and symbolic patterns, a visual mathematics that was more advanced and immediately applicable than the abstract philosophy taught to clerics in distant universities. The Guild Lodge was in effect the premier STEM school of the Middle Ages. This rigorous system created a powerful meritocratic ladder. The apprentice knew that if he endured, learned, and excelled, his future was not limited by his birth. After 7 years, if his master deemed him worthy, he would graduate to the status of journeyman, literally, a man paid by the day. His next phase of education was travel. He would journey from city to city, from lodge to lodge, working under different masters and absorbing regional techniques. He might learn a new method for constructing a spiral staircase in Rouen, then travel to Florence and discover an innovative approach to dome construction. He carried this knowledge with him, a living repository of pan-European engineering innovation. This cross-pollination was the Guild's research and development department, ensuring that best practices from across the continent were shared, adapted, and improved upon. The final, monumental step was the creation of his masterpiece. To become a master himself, the journeyman had to design and execute a work of staggering complexity that demonstrated his complete synthesis of practical skill and theoretical genius. This might be a detailed design for a full chapel facade, a scale model of a revolutionary flying buttress system, or an exquisitely carved structural element that was both beautiful and perfectly functional. His work was judged by a council of existing masters, a peer review that was brutally honest and uncompromising. There was no room for mediocrity. The structural integrity of a cathedral and the reputation of the entire guild depended on it. This system guaranteed that every man who earned the title of master was a true innovator and a guardian of a living tradition, a link in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back generations and would continue to build the future. Look up high above the bustling crowds of worshippers and tourists, nestled among the solemn saints and fearsome gargoyles designed to ward off evil spirits. There, perched on a rainspout or hiding in the shadow of an arch, you might spot something entirely unexpected: the stone-carved face of a local nobleman, but with the exaggerated features of a gluttonous pig. Or perhaps a bishop, depicted not with pious grace but with a bag of money clutched tightly in his hands. For centuries, these curious figures were dismissed as mere whimsy, the playful doodles of artisans amusing themselves during breaks from their serious labor. But this interpretation misses a deeper, far more subversive truth. These were not jokes. They were carefully calculated acts of symbolic rebellion, a silent protest chiseled into the very fabric of power itself. In a society where open criticism of the nobility or clergy could result in imprisonment, excommunication, or worse, the Mason guilds discovered a powerful loophole: the language of symbolism. A corrupt abbot known for levying harsh taxes on the poor could not be openly mocked in the town square, but he could be immortalized as a greedy fox stealing a chicken, carved into a misericord seat where only the choir would see it. A notoriously vain baron might find his likeness subtly transformed into a preening peacock gazing at its own reflection high up on a tower, visible to all but recognizable only to those who knew his failings. This visual satire was a dangerously clever game. It allowed the artisans to express the grievances of the common people, to critique the hypocrisy and corruption they witnessed daily, all while maintaining plausible deniability. If ever confronted, they could simply shrug and call it a harmless grotesque, a common decorative motif. But for those in the know, the local populace and the guild brothers themselves, the message was crystal clear. They were embedding a counter-narrative into the heart of the establishment, a permanent record of dissent that would outlive the very men it mocked. This rebellion extended beyond caricature and into the very geometry of the buildings. The magnificent rose windows that filter divine light into the cathedral's nave are often celebrated for their beauty, but their design may hold a deeper philosophical key. Some scholars studying the intricate tracery of these windows argue that the complex patterns based on sacred geometry, the pentagram, the Fibonacci spiral, the perfect ratios, were not just aesthetic choices. For the Masons, geometry was a language, a way of understanding a universal order they believed was accessible through reason and mathematics, not solely through clerical interpretation. By designing these windows according to these eternal principles, they were making a profound statement that the path to understanding the divine could be found through knowledge, measurement, and the application of human intellect. This was a quietly radical idea in an age where the Church maintained a monopoly on spiritual truth. The window, in this light, becomes a symbol of enlightenment, literally and figuratively shining a light on the power of human reason, a value held sacred by the artisan guilds who built their entire world on proven skill and observable science. This system of hidden communication required a shared understanding, a visual literacy that bound the guild members together across regions and generations. A specific knot pattern in a column capital might symbolize the unbreakable bonds of guild brotherhood. A particular arrangement of tiles in a floor might indicate the location of a secret meeting place or a hidden vault for storing their precious templates and charters. This clandestine language fostered an incredible sense of solidarity and identity. A journeyman traveling from a worksite in Spain to one in Scotland could look at a specific carving and know he was among friends, that the men who worked on this building shared his values and his secret defiance. It was a way of marking territory not for a feudal lord, but for the ideology of the skilled craftsman. They were inscribing their own values of merit, fairness, and collective action onto a structure meant to celebrate hierarchy and divine right, creating a stunning duality of meaning that has lasted for centuries. The cathedral thus stands not as a monument to a single idea, but as a palimpsest, a layered text where the official story of faith is interwoven with the quiet, persistent, and revolutionary voice of the artisans who dared to question the world around them, one carefully placed stone at a time. Walk through the gates of a thriving medieval town in the 1300s, and the first thing to capture your eye wouldn't just be the cathedral spire. Standing with equal prominence in the main square, often built from the same fine stone and with the same architectural pride, was the Mason Guild Hall. This was no mere workshop, it was a statement. Its very existence, grand and permanent, declared that the power dynamics of society were shifting. The Mason guilds were no longer just visitors hired to build the church. They had become foundational pillars of the urban community itself, instrumental in the very creation and governance of the cityscape that rose around them. Their influence extended from the physical stones of the streets to the highest seats of civic power, actively pulling the center of gravity away from the rural feudal manor and into the bustling, promising heart of the new urban world. This transformation began with the most tangible of contributions, the literal construction of the city's skeleton. Before a town could become a center of trade and ideas, it needed walls for defense, bridges for connection, and robust public buildings for administration. Who else possessed the engineering prowess to design a fortified gatehouse that could withstand a siege, or to span a rushing river with a stone bridge that would last for centuries? The guilds were the obvious choice. Their projects defined the urban experience. The thick, protective walls they built gave citizens security and a shared identity. Those within were burghers, townspeople, distinct from the rural peasantry. The reliable bridges they engineered became the lifelines of commerce, enabling the constant flow of goods and merchants that was the town's economic blood. And the crowning achievement, the town hall, was often their masterpiece, constructing this symbol of secular, civic authority, a building dedicated not to a bishop or a baron, but to the merchants and artisans who governed the town, was a profound act. It physically demonstrated that a new kind of power, based on commerce and collective skill, was now seated firmly at the table. Their role, however, swiftly moved from building the halls of power to occupying them. The wealth generated from decades of major projects, combined with their sophisticated organizational skills, made master masons natural leaders in the complex world of municipal politics. A man who could manage a budget for a cathedral, oversee a workforce of hundreds, and negotiate with a king was perfectly equipped to serve on a town council. These councils were responsible for the mundane but vital details of urban life, ensuring clean water supplies, maintaining paving on the streets, organizing night watchmen, and regulating market prices. The guilds brought their methodical, practical mindset to these tasks. They weren't abstract theorists, they were problem solvers who thought in terms of load-bearing walls and efficient drainage. This made them exceptionally effective at the gritty work of urban infrastructure, applying the same principles of sound engineering that raised cathedrals to the challenge of creating a livable, functional city for its inhabitants. This civic involvement represented a seismic shift in the medieval concept of authority. For centuries, leadership had been the exclusive domain of those who owned land and commanded military loyalty, the feudal aristocracy. The rise of guildsmen to positions of influence introduced a revolutionary new idea, that governance could also be a function of competence, economic success, and collective organization. A master mason on a town council derived his authority not from a hereditary title, but from the respect of his peers and his proven ability to manage immense projects. This model of merit-based participation challenged the very bedrock of the feudal system, suggesting that a community could be run effectively by its most skilled and prosperous members, regardless of their birth. The guild hall, therefore, stood as a direct counterpoint to the castle keep, one a symbol of power earned through knowledge and cooperation, the other a symbol of power seized by birthright and force. The environment this new urban power structure fostered was nothing short of revolutionary. Towns governed with significant input from guilds became magnets for innovation and economic energy. They passed laws that standardized weights and measures to facilitate fair trade, established courts that enforced contracts between merchants, and invested in infrastructure like paved streets and covered marketplaces that made commerce easier. This stable, predictable, and supportive environment was a fertile ground for the seeds of new ideas. It attracted not only other skilled craftsmen, but also artists, scholars, and inventors. The concentration of diverse talent, protected by walls built by masons and governed by councils that included masons, created a feedback loop of prosperity and creativity. This was the incubator for the Renaissance, a world where trade, finance, and intellectual curiosity could flourish precisely because the old feudal restraints were being loosened, stone by stone, by the very artisans who were building the new world around them. Yet even the most formidable stone structures are not immune to the relentless forces of change, and the same proved true for the guilds that built them. The world around them was shifting in profound ways, and a perfect storm of political, religious, and technological transformations began to erode the foundations of their centuries-old power. The first and perhaps most direct blow came from the rising tide of royal centralization, as kings in France, England, and Spain began to consolidate their power, building strong, unified nation-states. they viewed the guild's extensive legal autonomy not as a useful tool but as a threat to their own authority. Why should a group of stonemasons operate under their own laws, answerable only to a distant monarch or pope, when the king's justice was now administered by his own judges in every town? One by one, those precious charters that had once shielded the guilds from local lords were revoked or simply ignored by a new royal bureaucracy that demanded uniformity and control. The guild's right to hold their own courts, to set their own wages, and to govern their members was systematically stripped away, absorbed into the growing apparatus of the state. They were being transformed from self-governing republics of skill into mere trade associations, their legal independence a fading memory. At the very same time, a seismic intellectual shift was redefining the very concept of an architect and in the process devaluing the guild's core identity. The Renaissance ushered in the era of the architectural theorist, the gentleman scholar like Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote treatises on design based on classical principles and mathematical ideals. These men were not craftsmen. They were artists and intellectuals who saw building design as a primarily intellectual pursuit, separate from the messy, physical act of construction. To them, the master mason's deep, hands-on knowledge of stone and stress was seen as mere manual labor, a service to execute the grand vision of the designer. This created a new hierarchy on the construction site, where once a master mason like William of Sense was the undisputed authority, consulting with the bishop on both design and engineering. Now he might find himself taking orders from a court-appointed surveyor or a learned dilettante who had never laid a stone in his life but could draw a perfect Vitruvian proportion. The guild's cherished integration of design and craftsmanship was being split in two, and the prestige, along with the higher fees, was flowing to the designer, not the builder. This demotion was accelerated by the spiritual earthquake of the Reformation, which shattered the single most reliable source of patronage the guilds had ever known. Across Northern Europe, the new Protestant faiths rejected the elaborate religious visual culture of Catholicism, the veneration of saints, the need for pilgrimages, and the very theology that required vast, awe-inspiring cathedrals as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. All of it was swept away. Protestant worship focused on the word, the sermon, and the communal prayer, needs met by simpler, plainer churches. The great Catholic building projects that had employed generations of masons ground to a halt. In regions that remained Catholic, like Italy and Spain, the church still commissioned grand buildings, but the style had changed. The flamboyant Gothic complexity that was the guild's signature triumph gave way to the clean lines and massive forms of Renaissance and Baroque architecture, styles often directed by royal or papal court artists, further sidelining the traditional master mason. Technology, too, began to turn against them. The guild's power was built on a monopoly of knowledge around working stone, but new materials and methods were emerging. The increased use of brick, a material that required less specialized skill to lay, became popular for many civic and domestic structures. The development of more sophisticated ironworking led to new structural possibilities that fell outside the guild's traditional geometric rules. Perhaps most importantly, the invention of the printing press broke their centuries-long control over technical knowledge. The secrets of geometry, engineering, and design that had been painstakingly passed down through apprenticeships and guarded lodge manuscripts could now be published in books, available for anyone with the money to buy them. The guild's library was no longer the only repository of architectural wisdom, and their members were no longer its sole guardians. Finally, the relentless grind of war and economic crisis in the 14th and 15th centuries, The Hundred Years' War, the various Italian conflicts, and waves of plague recurrence fractured the guild's most vital asset, their pan-European network. Travel for journeymen became dangerous and often impossible, stifling the cross-pollination of ideas that had fueled innovation. Projects were abandoned halfway through for lack of funds, leaving lodges disbanded and craftsmen scattered. The golden age of cathedral building had passed, and though the mason guilds never vanished entirely, evolving into more general building trades or fraternal organizations, their unique period of influence, where skilled artisans stood as partners to bishops and kings, had irrevocably waned. They left behind not a void, but a vacuum that would be filled by the modern professions of architect, engineer, and contractor. Yet their legacy of meritocracy, collective bargaining, and breathtaking beauty remains permanently set into the very spine of Europe. This cultural bridge was built with the precise tools of geometry and meticulous observation, principles that would become the very bedrock of the Renaissance mind. For generations within the secluded lodges, master masons had treated geometry not as an abstract academic exercise, but as a sacred, practical language, the key to understanding the hidden order of the universe and translating it into stone. Their entire craft was a form of applied mathematics, a constant process of measuring, calculating, and testing theories against the unyielding reality of physics. When a vault held, it proved the geometric principle behind it. This relentless, hands-on engagement with empirical truth created a culture that valued what worked, what could be proven through demonstration and result. This was a profound departure from the dominant medieval scholastic tradition, which often sought truth through theological debate and the authority of ancient texts. The guilds were living by a different, more modern creed. Show me, don't just tell me. This practical, geometry-obsessed world, you did not stay confined to the construction yard. It inevitably seeped into the broader intellectual currents of the time, directly influencing the revolutionary artists who would define the Renaissance. Consider the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, filled with his intricate studies of human proportion, the flow of water, and the mechanics of flight. His approach was not that of a philosopher in an isolated chamber, but that of a master craftsman observing, dissecting, measuring, and understanding the world through its underlying geometric and mechanical principles. This was the exact same intellectual framework used by the master mason who calculated the load of a dome or the pitch of an arch. Leonardo's famous Vitruvian Man, a perfect human form inscribed within a circle and a square, is a direct echo of the symbolic diagrams used for centuries in mason lodges to illustrate divine harmony and proportion. The artist was applying the craftsman's tool, sacred geometry, to the natural world, blurring the line between artisan and scientist in a way that was utterly new to the elite art world but very old to the guild. Furthermore, the very model of the guild, a collaborative community dedicated to the preservation of knowledge, the training of apprentices, and the collective pursuit of a greater goal, provided a powerful blueprint for the new learning of the Renaissance. The gatherings of masons in their lodges, where masters and journeymen would debate structural problems, share sketches from distant work sites, and collectively judge the masterpieces of aspiring members, functioned as a prototype for the early scientific societies and academies that would later emerge. Institutions like the Royal Society in London or the Accademia dei Lincei in Rome were, in essence, formalized, intellectualized versions of the guild structure. They were built on the same principles, that progress is made through the sharing of knowledge among peers, that expertise should be tested and certified, and that collaboration yields better results than solitary toil. The Renaissance was not just born from individual geniuses working alone. It was fueled by a new culture of collective inquiry, a model that the Mason guilds had been perfecting for centuries. Perhaps one of their most unexpected roles was that of unwitting librarians for classical knowledge. While scholars in universities were rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved in Arabic translations or monastic libraries, the Mason guilds had been preserving a different, more tangible strand of classical wisdom through their architectural patterns. The proportions of the classical orders Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian were never entirely lost. They were maintained in the pattern books and template collections of guilds, especially in regions like Italy where Roman ruins were a constant presence and a practical source of building materials. The rounded arch, a hallmark of Roman engineering, persisted throughout the so-called Dark Ages and was a fundamental part of the mason's repertoire long before it was famously challenged by the Gothic pointed arch. When Renaissance thinkers like Brunelleschi looked back to the Pantheon for inspiration to build the great dome of the Florence Cathedral, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was building upon a continuous, albeit often overlooked, tradition of practical engineering that had been kept alive by the guilds, who had never stopped studying, adapting, and using the fragments of ancient wisdom embedded in the landscape around them. In this way, the stone builders acted as a vital link, ensuring that the practical genius of the ancients remained in the working vocabulary of Europe, ready to be rediscovered and celebrated when the intellectual climate was right. Imagine traveling from the sun-drenched plains of Spain to the misty forests of Germany, and then onto the bustling city-states of Italy. In each place, you would encounter a cathedral that proclaimed its origins not just through its dedication to a particular saint, but through the very language of its stonework. This incredible diversity of style, from the flamboyant to the austere, wasn't a matter of random chance or simple artistic preference. It was the direct result of Mason guilds acting as brilliant adapters, deeply tuning their craft to the specific materials, landscapes, and political realities of their home regions. They operated under a shared umbrella of core principles: geometry, quality control, and fraternity. But the expression of those principles was wonderfully localized, creating a rich tapestry of architectural dialects across medieval Europe. In Spain, the guilds developed a style that seems to defy the very nature of stone. Following the Reconquista, a wave of immense wealth and religious fervor washed over the country, and the guilds responded with the breathtaking intricacy of the Plateresque style. The name itself, derived from the Spanish word platero meaning silversmith, tells you everything you need to know. The facades of buildings like the University of Salamanca are not so much constructed as they are filigreed, with stone carved to resemble delicate lace, intricate jewelry, or sprawling, elaborate tapestry. This was a deliberate show of staggering technical skill, a way for guilds to demonstrate their virtuosity to powerful patrons like the Catholic monarchs. The stone itself, often a golden limestone that was softer and more amenable to detailed carving than the hard granite found elsewhere, practically invited this kind of elaborate decoration. The Spanish guilds became masters of surface, transforming massive walls into canvases of incredible detail that spoke of a culture confident, devout, and eager to showcase its splendor. Cross the Pyrenees into France, and you find guilds whose genius lay not on the surface, but in the bones of a building. French guilds were the structural innovators, the fearless engineers who were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was physically possible. Their driving obsession was height and light, a pursuit that led to the revolutionary development of the flying buttress. This wasn't merely a decorative element, it was a calculated structural exoskeleton that allowed them to build higher and higher, making the walls themselves almost unnecessary. The cathedrals of Chartres, Amiens, and Reims are testaments to this engineering prowess. The French guild's focus was on the sublime experience of space. They wanted worshippers to look up and feel dwarfed, to be surrounded by walls of stained glass that transformed sunlight into a divine spectacle. Their legacy is one of audacious ambition, a relentless drive to use geometry and physics to reach closer to the heavens, making the structure itself the star of the show. Now sail across the Channel to England, and the architectural language shifts dramatically once more. English guilds, perhaps influenced by a more pragmatic and reserved cultural spirit, developed a style that favored internal harmony and linear decoration over dizzying height. The English perpendicular style, perfected in buildings like Gloucester Cathedral and King's College Chapel, is instantly recognizable. It emphasizes strong, relentless vertical lines that run from the floor straight up into the vaulting, creating a sense of orderly, rhythmic grandeur. While the French were building outwards with buttresses, the English were building inwards, focusing on elaborate fan vaulting that spread across ceilings like intricate stone foliage. Their innovation was decorative and structural in a more contained way. They mastered the complex interplay of interior lines, creating spaces that feel both immense and intimate, overwhelming in their detail yet perfectly balanced and calm. The English guilds proved that awe could be inspired not just by overwhelming height, but by breathtaking complexity and perfect proportional balance. These stylistic choices were profoundly influenced by the very ground beneath their feet. The available local stone dictated everything. The fine-grained limestone of the Île-de-France region was perfect for the precise cutting and delicate tracery of French Gothic. The hard, rugged granite of parts of England and Spain demanded a different approach, often leading to more massive, robust forms or, in Spain's case, requiring a softer limestone for detailed work. In Italy, the abundant marble from Carrara encouraged a focus on classical perfection and sculptural detail that looked back to Rome rather than forward to new structural forms. The guilds had no choice but to become experts in their local geology, and their greatest designs were a conversation between their ambitions and the materials Mother Nature provided. Furthermore, the political landscape shaped their organization just as deeply. In the independent, wealthy city-states of Italy, guilds were not isolated entities. They were woven directly into the fabric of civic government. A master mason in Florence or Siena was often a prominent citizen, participating in guilds that were powerful political lobbies and part of the city's ruling structure. This integration meant their work was deeply tied to civic pride and Renaissance humanism. In contrast, the guilds in the many smaller states of Germany developed a culture of intense secrecy and strict internal control, a necessity for maintaining their privileges and hard-won knowledge across a fractured and often volatile political map. This led to famously guarded lodges and complex initiation rituals, protecting their methods as they worked from one independent duchy to the next. In England, where a stronger central monarchy existed, guilds often operated under direct royal patronage, leading to more standardized national styles and projects that reflected the power of the crown, such as the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. The architecture we admire today is therefore a frozen record of medieval politics, a physical manifestation of how these skilled men navigated and were shaped by the very different worlds in which they lived and worked. While their legacy is most visibly etched in the soaring stone of cathedrals, the true genius of the Mason guilds was not confined to the sacred. Their mastery of physics, chemistry, and mechanics was a versatile toolkit applied to the most pressing practical challenges of their age, transforming the everyday landscape of medieval Europe in ways that fed, protected, and mobilized entire societies. Consider the humble watermill, a fixture of the rural landscape. While not their invention, its construction and complex gearing were often the domain of the guilds. A local lord might want to harness a river to grind grain. But turning that vision into a functioning, efficient machine required a precise understanding of hydraulics, wooden gear ratios, and structural integrity to withstand the constant force of flowing water, skills that only the builders of vaults and buttresses possessed. A guild would be contracted to design the mill's foundation, its water wheel, and the intricate system of shafts and gears that transferred power to the grinding stones. Their work didn't just bake bread, it amplified agricultural output, forming the mechanical backbone of the medieval economy and freeing countless hands from manual labor. This expertise in managing immense forces and weights found its most critical expression in the construction of bridges. To build a permanent stone bridge across a powerful river was one of the most daring engineering feats of the Middle Ages, a task that fell squarely to the mason guilds. The challenges were immense. They had to design piers strong enough to resist the current scour and the impact of debris, often by using ingenious cofferdams, temporary watertight enclosures, to create a dry work site on the riverbed. The arches themselves had to be perfectly calculated to distribute weight and thrust, ensuring the bridge wouldn't collapse under the load of a busy trade route or a marching army. Bridges like the Pont Vaillantre in Cahors, France, with its 3 formidable fortified towers, stand as monuments to this dual role of the guilds, as both civil engineers and military architects, creating structures that were simultaneously arteries of commerce and formidable defensive choke points. Their innovative spirit extended even underground into the dark, dangerous world of mining. As demand for metals and stone grew, guilds were called upon to solve the complex problems of extraction. They designed and shored up mine shafts to prevent catastrophic collapses, applying the same principles of load distribution they used for vaulted ceilings to the oppressive weight of the earth above. They developed advanced drainage systems using water-powered pumps and clever channeling to keep mines from flooding, a technology that would later prove vital for the deep mining operations of the Industrial Revolution. In the quarries that supplied their cathedrals, they perfected the art of extracting massive blocks using carefully placed wedges and levers, and engineered sophisticated networks of ramps and roads to transport these monstrous weights. Their role was integral to the entire supply chain, from pulling the stone from the ground to placing the final pinnacle high in the air. The tools they developed for these tasks were marvels of medieval ingenuity. The great treadwheel crane, a human-powered wonder often built within the rising skeleton of the cathedral itself, was their invention. A team of men walking inside a large wooden wheel could generate enough torque to lift multi-ton stones hundreds of feet into the air with remarkable precision. These cranes were modular and portable, designed to be disassembled and moved upward as the building grew. Beyond heavy lifting, their chemical knowledge was a form of ancient materials science. The quest for the perfect mortar was a relentless pursuit. Guilds experimented with different lime mixtures, adding volcanic ash, crushed brick, or even animal blood to create compounds that set faster, were more waterproof, or had greater bonding strength. They developed durable, vibrant pigments for stained glass and wall paintings, guarding recipes that produced the deep blues and radiant reds that still dazzle us today. They were, in every sense, applied scientists, conducting centuries of rigorous, practical research that left a permanent mark on the technological trajectory of Europe, proving that the path to progress was often paved by the calloused hands of a craftsman. Beyond the precise calculations and the sheer physical effort of construction, many master masons understood their craft as something far more profound than a simple profession. For these men, the compass and the square were not merely tools for measurement, they were instruments for unlocking the secrets of the universe itself. They saw in the perfect proportions of a circle, the unerring lines of a right angle, and the mystical ratios of the golden section a reflection of a divine order, a hidden geometry that they believed was the very language God used to create the world. This wasn't just a job, it was a form of active prayer, a sacred calling that elevated the mason from a simple artisan to a participant in the ongoing work of creation, using stone and mortar to echo the harmony of the heavens here on earth. This sacred approach to their work was made visible in the solemn rituals that marked key moments in a building's life. The ceremony for laying a foundation stone was particularly charged with meaning. It was far more than a practical beginning. It was an act of consecration designed to align the structure with both spiritual and cosmic forces. Before the first stone was set, the site would be purified, often with salt and water, echoing ancient traditions of protecting a space from malevolent spirits. The master mason, using his tools, would carefully orient the building on its east-west axis, ensuring the rising sun on the feast day of the church's patron saint would flood the altar with light. This alignment connected the man-made structure to the cycles of the cosmos, weaving the building into the fabric of time and the divine plan. Often, relics of saints would be sealed within the foundation stone, or coins and other tokens would be placed there, a practice that blended Christian veneration with much older pagan customs of making offerings to the spirits of the land for protection and stability. This unique blend of Christian faith and pre-Christian tradition was a hallmark of the Guild's spiritual world. While they were devoutly Christian men working for the church, their deep connection to the earth, to the stone from quarries, the timber from forests, the lime from kilns kept them in touch with an older, more animistic worldview. The grotesques and gargoyles they carved, often depicting nature spirits, green men, and mythical beasts, were more than just decoration or water spouts. Many scholars believe they served as protective talismans, wardens placed high on the walls to guard the sacred space within from unseen harm, a concept that has roots far deeper than medieval Christianity. This syncretic spirituality allowed them to honor the church's doctrines while also acknowledging the mysterious, raw power of the natural world they worked with every day. This rich spiritual and ritualistic culture created an incredibly strong sense of identity and purpose among the guild members. The knowledge that they were engaged in a sacred task, that their work was literally shaping the physical manifestation of faith for their community, provided a powerful antidote to the hardship and danger of their labor. It fostered an intense brotherhood, a sense that they were initiates in a special mystery that set them apart from other trades. The rituals, the symbolic language of their tools, and the secret knowledge passed down through generations all contributed to a feeling of being part of something much larger than themselves, a timeless tradition of builders that stretched back to the mythic architects of Solomon's temple. The echoes of these traditions are the subject of much historical debate, particularly their connection to the fraternal organizations that emerged centuries later, most notably Freemasonry. It is certainly tempting to draw a direct line from the secretive rituals and symbolic tools of the medieval Mason guilds to the esoteric practices of speculative Freemasonry that appeared in the 17th and 18th centuries. Many of the symbols, the square, the compass, the rough and smooth ashlars, are shared between the two. However, most historians caution against a simple, direct lineage. The evidence suggests that when the operative Mason guilds began to decline, their structures and legends were adopted and transformed by gentlemen scholars and intellectuals who were less interested in building physical cathedrals and more interested in using the Mason's metaphors for moral and philosophical building. The medieval guilds were primarily practical, their rituals focused on the protection and success of a physical project. The later fraternal orders were speculative, using the stonemason's tools as allegories for building a better self and a better society. So while the medieval guilds may not have been the first Freemasons, they provided the powerful symbols, the compelling myths, and the structural model that inspired a movement which would itself go on to shape the modern world in countless ways. The organizational blueprint crafted by the Mason guilds did not vanish with the last Gothic spire. Instead, it became a deeply embedded template for how modern society structures skilled professions. At first glance, a medieval lodge and a contemporary engineering institute seem worlds apart, but they are connected by a shared DNA of standards, certification, and collective ethics. The guild's most enduring innovation was arguably their system for guaranteeing quality and trust, creating a framework where a patron in one city could hire a master from another with absolute confidence in his skills. This was the genesis of professional licensure. Before a mason could charge for his work or train others, he had to prove his competence not to a king or a bishop, but to a jury of his exact peers, the other master craftsmen who had already achieved the highest rank. This peer review process ensured that the title of master was not an empty honorific, but a reliable stamp of excellence, a guarantee that the holder possessed a comprehensive understanding of geometry, structural mechanics, and artistic design. This system effectively transferred the power to define expertise from the aristocratic patron to the professional community itself, establishing a self-regulating body that protected its own reputation by fiercely upholding its standards. This commitment to maintained excellence did not end with the masterpiece. The guilds instituted what we would now recognize as mandatory continuing education. A journeyman was required to travel, absorbing new techniques and regional styles, ensuring his knowledge remained current and diverse. Even masters were expected to participate in lodge meetings where complex structural problems were debated and new solutions were proposed, a constant process of intellectual cross-pollination that prevented skills from stagnating. This created a culture of lifelong learning, where the entire profession advanced collectively because every member was expected to contribute to and draw from a constantly evolving pool of knowledge. The lodge was, in essence, a permanent conference and a technical university rolled into one, ensuring that a building technique perfected in Flanders could be improving a cathedral in Normandy within a few seasons. Furthermore, the guild's intricate ethical codes laid the groundwork for modern professional conduct. Their statutes went far beyond technical rules, governing everything from fair pricing and honest contracting to the resolution of disputes between members. A master who used substandard stone or attempted to undercut a fellow guildsman's contract faced severe fines or even expulsion. This enforced a remarkable level of integrity across the industry, building a reputation for trustworthiness that became the guild's most valuable commercial asset. Clients knew that hiring a guild mason meant hiring someone bound by a strict code of honor, not just a lone artisan. This concept of a profession being self-policing, where the collective reputation is safeguarded by holding every individual to a high ethical standard, is a direct inheritance from these medieval associations. It's the same principle that underpins the codes of conduct for modern lawyers, doctors, and engineers, who are ultimately accountable to their professional bodies. Perhaps their most revolutionary contribution was the guild's demonstration that a functional and respected hierarchy could be built on merit rather than birthright. In a world dominated by hereditary lords, they created a parallel structure where authority was earned through demonstrated skill and peer validation. An apprentice could realistically dream of one day becoming a master and leading his own workshop, his social and economic standing transformed by his own talent and diligence. This model of meritocracy presented a powerful, working alternative to the rigid feudal order, proving that a society could effectively organize itself around competence. This tangible example of a knowledge-based hierarchy deeply influenced Enlightenment thinkers, who began to argue that governance itself might be improved by incorporating expertise and reasoned judgment, ideas that would eventually fuel revolutions and reshape governments. The quiet, persistent work of the Mason guilds showed Europe that there was another way to value human potential, planting the seeds for our modern belief that skill, knowledge, and ethical professional conduct are the true foundations of a prosperous and respected society. For centuries, the story of the Mason guilds was woven primarily from parchment, from contracts, ledgers, and the occasional chronicle. These written records told us what they built and for how much, but they left their daily world, their tools, and their methods shrouded in silence. That silence is now being broken, not by the discovery of a lost manuscript, but by the slow, careful work of the trowel and the brush. Modern archaeology is allowing these forgotten artisans to speak for themselves through the physical objects they left behind, painting a picture of their lives that is far more vivid, nuanced, and human than any historical account could provide. The most intimate discoveries come from the excavation of the workshops themselves. At sites like the one surrounding the Cathedral in Canterbury, England, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of the lodges, not just the grand halls, but the temporary workshops that hugged the construction sites. Here they find the tangible debris of centuries of labor, piles of stone chips from countless careful strikes, the worn-down nubs of chalk used for marking precise lines on rough stone, and the fragments of the oiled parchment that protected their precious architectural drawings from the elements. Each of these humble objects is a direct window into the rhythm of their workday. We can almost hear the constant tap, tap, tap of the chisel, see the master mason pointing to a diagram, and feel the concentration of the apprentice learning to transfer a geometric design from a small template to a massive block of stone. This wasn't a chaotic building site, it was a highly organized, open-air factory buzzing with specialized activity. Perhaps the most telling finds are the tools themselves. Unearthing a mason's toolkit is like discovering a surgeon's instruments. There are the heavy pitching hammers for rough shaping stone straight from the quarry, the finer points and chisels for detailed carving, and the iconic metal compasses and dividers, often ornately decorated, which were the sacred instruments of their geometric art. The wear patterns on these tools tell a story of a lifetime of use. A hammer handle polished smooth by a constant grip, a chisel blade worn down by years of sharpening on a grindstone. These are the fingerprints of the craftsman himself. Analysis of these tools shows incredible sophistication. They were made from high-quality iron and steel, carefully forged and maintained, representing a significant personal investment. A mason's tools were his livelihood, and archaeology shows us just how well cared for they were, passed down from master to apprentice like family heirlooms. But the guild's secrets aren't just hidden in the dirt, they are encoded in the very buildings we walk past every day. The most widespread and fascinating archaeological evidence is found on the stones themselves, the mason's marks. For a long time, these small, carved symbols were thought to be simple identifiers. Now, through meticulous digital surveying and database analysis, archaeologists are using them to rewrite history. By cataloging these marks across different cathedrals and castles, researchers can now trace the movement of individual masons across Europe like never before. They can identify a specific craftsman by his unique mark on a cathedral in northern France, and then find that same mark on a castle in southern England a decade later. This allows us to map the invisible networks of these skilled workers, showing how knowledge and style were physically carried by these journeymen from one great project to the next, connecting the continent in a web of shared technique and innovation. The very glue that holds these buildings together is also now revealing its secrets. Advanced chemical analysis of medieval mortar is a game changer. By studying the microscopic composition of mortar samples from different regions, scientists can identify distinct, localized recipes, like a culinary fingerprint for each guild. One guild might have preferred a mix with a specific type of sand from a local riverbed, while another might have added crushed terracotta tiles or even volcanic ash to create a stronger, more hydraulic set. These weren't random mixtures, they were the result of generations of experimentation, closely guarded trade secrets that gave a guild's work its renowned durability. Finding the same unique mortar recipe in two distant buildings strongly suggests the involvement of the same guild, providing physical proof of their far-reaching contracts and the consistent application of their hard-won knowledge. This growing body of archaeological evidence does more than just confirm what was written in old ledgers. It adds profound depth and color to our understanding. It confirms that these guilds were not mythical brotherhoods but sophisticated, practical organizations. It shows us the individual men behind the monuments, allows us to track their journeys, and lets us hold the very tools that shaped history. Each fragment of stone, each speck of ancient mortar, and each tiny symbol carved in silence is a voice from the past, ensuring that the legacy of the master masons is no longer written only in words, but permanently cemented into the physical world they so brilliantly built. Long after the last medieval cathedral was completed and the master masons put away their tools, something curious began to happen in the quiet corners of Europe. The historical reality of these stone builders, their contracts, their wages, their precise geometric calculations started to blur and transform. The guilds were fading from living memory, but they were being reborn in the realm of story and legend. The very secrecy that had once protected their trade knowledge now became a blank canvas onto which the public imagination could paint tales of profound mystery and cosmic significance. The master mason, once a respected professional, was on his way to becoming a mythical figure, a wizard of stone who commanded forces far beyond the ordinary. These legends often centered on the idea of hidden knowledge, vast and powerful, locked away from the common world. Folktales sprang up across the continent about secret vaults concealed beneath great cathedrals. These weren't storerooms for tools or templates, but legendary libraries said to contain the lost wisdom of Atlantis, the architectural secrets of Solomon's temple, or even heretical scriptures that challenged the very foundations of the church. The guild's known practice of encoding their techniques in complex symbols only fueled these fires. To an uninitiated observer, a mason's geometric diagram for a vault might look like a magical sigil or a map to a hidden treasure. The guild's legitimate need for privacy had accidentally constructed the perfect stage for myth-making, convincing later generations that these men were not just building churches, but guarding the world's greatest secrets within their very walls. The most pervasive and enduring legend to emerge from this haze of mystery was the Faustian tale of the master builder who makes a pact with a supernatural being. The archetype is found in countless variations from Germany to England. The story goes that a community desires to build a magnificent structure, a bridge, a church, a spire, but the task seems impossible. The river is too wild, the design too ambitious. Then, a mysterious stranger appears, an architect of unparalleled skill who offers to complete the project in an impossibly short time. His price, however, is steep. He demands the first soul to cross the completed bridge or enter the new church. The community, desperate, agrees, believing they can trick the stranger by shooing a dog or a rooster across first. But in the tragic twist, the first soul to cross is invariably a loved one, a wife bringing the builder his lunch, a child chasing a ball, and the devilish architect claims his prize, often vanishing in a puff of smoke, leaving behind a perfect but haunted structure. This chilling narrative, while pure fiction, is a powerful piece of cultural psychology. It reflects the genuine awe and unease these guilds inspired. Their ability to perform what seemed like miracles of engineering, to make stone soar and defy gravity, felt, to the medieval mind, almost supernatural. How could mere mortals achieve such things without some otherworldly assistance? The legend also captures the ambiguous social position of the guilds. They were essential yet separate, admired yet distrusted. They moved between the world of the common people and the powerful clergy, operating under their own laws and rituals. The devilish architect of folklore is the embodiment of this anxiety about a power that is both necessary and dangerously outside the control of the community, a force that builds marvels but at a terrifying, unknown cost. This rich soil of legend proved irresistible to the artists and writers of the Romantic era, who were themselves in rebellion against the cold rationality of the Enlightenment. They saw in the Mason guilds not historical tradesmen, but kindred spirits, romantic rebels, solitary geniuses, and keepers of arcane wisdom. Victor Hugo, in his monumental novel The Hunchback of Notre Dame, did more than any historian to fix the image of the Gothic cathedral in the popular mind. But for Hugo, the cathedral was a living book, its every sculpture a word, and its every facade a page written by the hand of the people. He explicitly credited the guilds with this achievement, portraying them as the collective artistic genius of an entire age, using stone to write a universal language that could be read by the illiterate and the learned alike. He transformed them from craftsmen into poet-priests of architecture. Across the Channel, the visionary poet and artist William Blake drew deeply from the well of Mason mythology, though he filtered it through his own unique mystical system. Blake was fascinated by the figure of the divine architect, a concept central to the guild's own view of geometry as God's language. He embraced their tools, the compass, the hammer, the forge, as powerful symbols of creative force and spiritual rebellion. For Blake, the act of building was not just physical construction, but a metaphor for building a new Jerusalem of the imagination, free from the mental chains of organized religion and oppressive state power. In his famous etching, often called the Ancient of Days, he depicts a godlike figure leaning out from the sun, wielding a massive compass to measure out the universe. This image is a direct homage to the Master Mason, reconceived as a cosmic creator. The guilds, for Blake, became symbolic ancestors for his own ideal of the artist as a prophetic figure who builds new worlds through visionary labor. This cultural absorption, from historical fact to romantic symbol, ensured the guild's immortality long after their economic and social power had waned. They transcended their specific time and place to become a permanent part of the West's storytelling toolkit. They evolved into universal symbols of human creativity pitted against impossible odds, of the application of reason and skill to shape a chaotic world, and of the quiet resistance of the skilled worker against the brute forces of ignorance and authority. Every time we tell a story about a brilliant engineer who defies convention, an artist who hides a secret message in their work, or a secret society that guards ancient knowledge, we are walking in the footsteps of the myths that grew up around these medieval builders. The actual men who built Notre Dame or Chartres might be forgotten by name, but the legendary figures they inspired, the master builder, the keeper of secrets, the architect of reality, remain with us, a testament to the awe that is permanently wired into our species when we stand before something both beautiful and seemingly impossible, a monument to the incredible power of the human hand, limitless reach of the human mind. We live in a world that often feels increasingly transient, where careers are a patchwork of short-term gigs and products are designed for obsolescence. In this landscape of the disposable, the enduring legacy of the medieval Mason guilds feels not just historical but startlingly urgent. Their model, forged in an entirely different age, offers a powerful set of counter-values for our modern professional lives, presenting a vision of work that is sustainable, deeply supported, and focused on the long arc of legacy rather than the next quarterly report. They teach us that a profession is more than a job. It is a community, a culture, and a covenant between generations. Consider the profound crisis of the modern skills gap, where industries desperately need highly trained workers but traditional education pathways often fail to provide them. The Guild's apprenticeship system presents a brilliantly effective, time-tested solution. This was not a vague internship or a few weeks of on-the-job training. It was a rigorous, multi-year immersion that blended relentless hands-on practice with deep theoretical knowledge. An apprentice didn't just learn how to swing a hammer, he learned the sacred geometry that explained why the arch he was building wouldn't collapse. This holistic approach, merging the academic with the practical, ensured that knowledge was not just abstractly understood but physically mastered. For our world, this suggests a radical rethinking of professional training. Imagine a system where aspiring software engineers, nurses, or renewable energy technicians undergo a similar fusion of classroom learning and long-term, paid, mastery-based mentorship under seasoned experts. It's a model that closes the gap between theory and practice, creating truly proficient professionals instead of just credentialed ones. This focus on mentorship speaks directly to another modern ailment: professional isolation. The gig economy, for all its flexibility, can be a lonely and precarious existence, offering little security or sense of belonging. The guilds functioned as the ultimate professional support network. They weren't just a trade association, they were a brotherhood, and as we've seen, sometimes a sisterhood that provided a comprehensive safety net. If a mason fell ill, the guild would support his family. When he grew too old to lift stones, the guild ensured he wasn't cast into poverty. This system was built on a powerful principle of mutual obligation, the understanding that the strength of the individual was inextricably linked to the strength of the collective. In an age of solo entrepreneurs and remote work, this ancient idea of a professional community that actively cares for its members feels revolutionary. It's a potent argument for modern unions, professional associations, and even companies to reinvest in a culture of mutual support, recognizing that the well-being of the worker is the true foundation of lasting, high-quality work. Furthermore, the Guild's fierce commitment to quality and ethics stands as a stark contrast to a culture that often prioritizes speed and low cost above all else. Their system of Mason's marks was a genius mechanism of individual accountability, ensuring that every craftsman took personal pride in their work because their reputation was literally set in stone. They enforced strict standards for materials and methods, understanding that cutting corners on mortar or using substandard stone would lead to catastrophic failure decades later. This long-term perspective is desperately needed today. In a world of fast fashion, planned obsolescence, and software riddled with bugs, the Guild ethic champions a different path: the deep satisfaction of creating something that is not just good enough but built to last. It connects the dignity of the worker directly to the durability and integrity of the product, arguing that true value is measured in centuries, not financial quarters. Perhaps their most nuanced lesson lies in their ability to hold two seemingly opposing forces in perfect balance: fierce competition and essential collaboration. Guilds competed intensely with one another to secure the best contracts and to build the most awe-inspiring structures, a rivalry that drove incredible innovation. Yet, when faced with a project too large for any single lodge, or when a traveling journeyman arrived with new knowledge, they seamlessly shifted into a mode of cooperation. They understood that sharing certain techniques elevated the entire profession, making everyone better. This is the exact blueprint for a healthy modern innovation ecosystem. It's the model of open-source software development, where companies compete fiercely in the marketplace but collaborate on the underlying code that benefits everyone. It argues against a mindset of cutthroat, winner-take-all competition, and for a more nuanced approach where we can compete on execution while cooperating on the foundational knowledge that pushes the entire human project forward. The Mason Guilds show us that the future isn't about choosing between competition and collaboration, but about mastering the art of knowing when to use each, all for the greater goal of collective progress. The hidden rebellion of the stone builders was not fought with swords but with chisels, not in battles but in quarries and cathedrals. These master craftsmen waged a silent war against the rigid confines of their age, using their irreplaceable skills as both shield and weapon. In a world where power was supposed to be inherited through bloodline and divine right, they built a new kind of influence from the ground up, one perfectly cut stone at a time. Their revolution was etched into the very skyline of Europe, a permanent declaration that knowledge, collective action, and human ingenuity could reshape the foundations of society itself. Mason guilds quietly challenged feudal norms not through loud proclamations, but through the relentless, practical application of their leverage. They transformed the relationship between labor and authority, introducing the radical idea that highly specialized skill deserved respect, fair compensation, and a seat at the table. By organizing into powerful collectives, they could stare down a bishop or a baron and negotiate contracts, safe working conditions, and wages that lifted them from the status of common serfs to that of respected professionals. Their strategic work stoppages were some of the earliest recorded strikes, proving that the withdrawal of essential expertise could bring the ambitions of the mighty to a grinding halt. This was a profound shift away from a system of obligation and toward a system of contract, planting the early seeds for modern concepts of workers' rights and the very dignity of labor. Their contribution extended far beyond the negotiating table, actively advancing technology in ways that defined an era. These guilds were the research and development hubs of the Middle Ages, pushing the boundaries of materials science, physics, and engineering. The breathtaking innovations of the flying buttress and the ribbed vault were not sudden miracles but the culmination of generations of careful observation, experimentation, and recorded knowledge passed down through their apprenticeship systems. They perfected recipes for mortar that could last centuries, designed the formidable treadwheel cranes that were the heavy machinery of their day, and their understanding of structural forces allowed them to create spaces of such awe-inspiring height and light that they still captivate us today. This was applied science of the highest order, driven by the practical need to solve problems and leave a legacy that would stand the test of time. The cultural landscape of Europe was literally shaped by their hands and their vision. The great cathedrals, castles, and bridges they built are more than just beautiful monuments. They are the very pillars of European identity. These structures became the centers of urban life, the engines of economic prosperity, and the symbols of civic pride that drew people together from the countryside into thriving new communities. But their cultural impact is also found in the subtle details, the mischievous gargoyles, the hidden masons' marks, the caricatures of corrupt officials carved in stone. These were the silent commentaries of the artisans, a way of embedding their own voice, their humor, and their critique into the heart of the establishment, ensuring that the story of the common people was told alongside the grand narratives of faith and power. The legacy they left behind echoes powerfully in our own world, visible in our built environment and ingrained in our professional practices. Every time we see a skyline defined by ambitious architecture, we are witnessing the continuation of their dream to reach for the heavens. The very way we organize skilled professions today with standardized training, professional certifications, ethical codes, and peer review is a direct inheritance from the guild model. They established the precedent that expertise should be validated by a community of peers, that knowledge should be passed down through rigorous mentorship, and that a profession should hold itself to a high standard of quality and integrity. Their belief in a meritocracy where a person could rise based on their skill and not their birth remains a powerful and aspirational ideal in our modern society. Their story is a timeless reminder that profound change does not always arrive with the clash of armies or the pronouncements of kings. Often, it is forged in the quiet, determined, collective action of skilled and dedicated individuals who master their craft and understand their own value. It is the story of those who build, who create, and who, through the simple act of doing their job with excellence and solidarity, can quietly challenge the world and make it new. As we look at medieval structures today, we see not just stone and glass, but the fingerprints of that revolution crafted in silence. We see the enduring power of knowledge, the strength found in community, and the incredible legacy that is built not by monuments alone, but by